All right. Today, I mean, we are going to discuss, of course, the EU resolution on Bahrain 2 days ago, and as you know, I mean, this matters. Everybody in Bahrain is asking about this resolution, and personally, I get a lot of like dozens of messages in WhatsApp and Twitter and Instagram, and saying to me, for example, Sayed, do you think that in the next few days, weeks, months, we are going to see the prisoners are free? So, and how this going to help the situation in Bahrain? And there are many people. There are some people optimistic, and there are some people not. Disappointed, and they say that these resolution and recommendation are doesn't change the situation. So there is a debate between a lot of people. So that's why I thought that it's very important also to discuss this with you. Yes. So my first question, will be that this is not the first time, that this statement and resolution, either by the United Nations or the EU Parliament, condemning the practice and abuses in Bahrain. And for us, the question: how significant are these, statements, and how much do you think this can by bounding the government of Bahrain? And so that's my first question.
All right, and thank you very much for inviting me to come and talk to you today. I felt over the last 10 years or so since I've been working on Bahraini issues that I'm an outsider. I'm not Bahraini, but I guess with this issue, at least, I have some validity, and I'm an EU citizen. And that's my parliament, in a sense, which is trying to do something. Look, these resolutions, whether they're by the EU Parliament or the US Congress or the UN Human Rights Council, by themselves, they don't change very much at all. Like there is nothing now, because of the resolution, which forces the EU to change its behavior. It calls on the EU to, for instance, stop selling certain types of weapons to Bahrain, to stop selling certain types of surveillance equipment. But that doesn't mean that the EU has to do that. Now, it's a strong call, but that's sort of all that it is. But I don't think these resolutions are useless. There's, in two ways. First of all, there's a sort of a cumulative effect where, the Bahraini government just must be tired of this year after year, whether it's the EU Parliament or it's some other parliament, whether it's NGOs, whether it's the UN, or it's Congress, or it's Canada, whoever it is. The Bahraini government really is increasingly defined internationally by its poor human rights record. What it wants to be, its international reputation, is a place that hosts the Formula One, the place that's inclusive and welcoming of business interests, it's very good for investment, blah, blah, blah. But it hasn't really been able to control that reputation for at least a decade. And that is because Bahraini political and human rights activists, including yourself and many people based out of Bahrain, Bahraini exiles, have managed, I think massively, impressively, to keep this on the international media agenda and, like this resolution, on the international political agenda. So in itself, it doesn't transform anything. It really matters. Now they have to dedicate resources to try and counter this and show it's not wrong. And of course, eventually they'll realize that the way to stop getting bad publicity is to stop doing terrible things. So that's the first use of it. The second use of it is that I think if, and it's a big if there are those within the Bahraini government who are looking to make some steps for reform, whether it's to release certain prisoners, or whether it's to stop torture, or whether it's to stop the death sentences. This sort of thing gives them an excuse to argue that those things should happen. So whether it's, you know, and they can find whatever excuse they want if they want to find the political will, whether they say, well, because of Ramadan, because of Eid, we're going to free these 20 prisoners, political or human rights prisoners, then this sort of statement, I think, helps to encourage that. But by itself, the statement can't do that. But by itself, this resolution cannot have even EU citizen Abdul Hadi al-Khawaja, it cannot have him released. It can just call on the EU to call for his release and to call for the Bahraini government. So I think these are all good things when these resolutions come, and, you know, other countries who are living under authoritarian and repressive governments would also like the European Parliament to be doing this sort of thing. But by themselves, no, let's not pretend that this is going to change the situation in Bahrain, you know, this week or next month or this coming year. It's not.
Okay, thank you. I mean, so also there are also questions also in regards to the EU Parliament. I mean, you know, what do you think are the tools that the EU Parliament has, and they can push the government of Bahrain towards immediate solution? Is there something like that you think that the EU, either your EU Union or Parliament, like in, both? I mean, like, do you think there are such things possible to have like immediate solution?
I guess
this is also a question that it's been circulated in Bahraini social media, so that's why I'm bringing all of these questions.
Okay. Thank you. So I think there are two things. Let's suppose in best case scenario, the EU really decides it's going to go full force, everything it can to try and encourage and urge and pressure the Bahraini government to reform. There is a lot more it can do. But in the end, really, the EU cannot force radical change in Bahrain. It can stop supplying Bahrain with weapons and political support. It can really up the rhetoric in the international condemnation. If it really wanted to, for instance, it could stop inviting and even ban the Bahraini ruling family from visiting the EU. Okay. But those things are pretty extreme steps for it to take. And I'm not sure it's going to take many or any of those. And even if it did all of those, in the end, that wouldn't transform what's happening in Bahrain. So while I think the resolution is mostly good and pretty strong, it does some good things. It names individual prisoners, which is good. It talks about stopping arms exports. It talks about stopping torture. It talks about stopping the executions. There's some nonsense in there also in that resolution, where it encourages the Bahraini government to develop its ongoing reform. Now, there is no ongoing reform, right? Or at least, at very best, it's invisible, but I think it's non-existent. So I'm tired, honestly, and you know, if I'm tired, Bahrainis must be tired of this 10 years or more of government saying, yes, well done, you have an ombudsman's office. Yes, well done, you have an NHRI. Yes, well done, you're entering into dialogue. All of that really is fake. Now, I understand why international governments do that. There's an argument that, you know, you need to encourage even a small glimmer of reform. I understand the logic of that. But the Bahraini government really needs to earn that credit and earn that praise. And it's not doing it. I mean, there is no reform. There is no real dialogue. And so much as the resolution has good things in it, I think it's false and it's counterproductive to pretend that there's some even small ongoing reform where there just isn't.
Okay, so I do have also another question also in terms of the EU Parliament, and then we will change to another area. So the last question also in terms of EU Parliament, also a lot of people are asking me and also asking in social media that if there is like, I mean the latest EU resolution on Bahrain, does the EU Parliament has kind of a direct communication with the Bahraini government to make sure that this recommendation or resolution implemented? Is there such kind of a commission to make sure, or it's just a resolution and they are waiting the reaction? And so how this functions? You know, that's a lot of people asking how does it work.
So in terms of the diplomatic signal it sends, it's pretty powerful, but it's not actually powerful in terms of beyond words. I mean, it just isn't, right? This does not change EU policy. It calls on the EU governments to change their policy, excuse me, but by itself, it does not stop the things that it calls for. It does not stop the arms transfers or the surveillance equipment. It calls on the EU to do that. So it does not guarantee a change in policy. Now, it encourages a change in policy. The other thing I'd say too on a more local level is that, you know, there are a couple of EU embassies in Bahrain. Now, of course, Britain is no longer in the EU, but Italy and France, I think, are still there. And again, in terms of one of the things that the EU as a whole and individual governments could do if they wanted, is to really make full use through those embassies of objecting. But, you know, again, most of this is words. Words matter, but by themselves, they are not going to bring about the sort of reform which Bahrain desperately needs.
Okay. So also I have more question about. I think also you have seen the interview between the Crown Prince and the chief editors. I'm not sure, but anyway, there were like there were interview between Salman bin Hamad Al Khalifa, the Crown Prince, with the editors-in-chief of local newspaper, you know. And he talked about many things in terms of human rights. Like for example, he mentioned main reforms he highlighted were the law enforcement authorities to depend on conclusive material evidence while pressing charges against individual, looking beyond confession, so that he makes sure that there shouldn't be the confession. And also he had called for a comprehensive review of the justice system in Bahrain based on the open prison approach. So these two things, what is your comment on this?
I'm wary of that. Let's see. I mean, there is nothing now stopping him making that happen. But I'm dubious. I'm skeptical. I mean, we've heard it all before, right? We heard in 2011 the king promised to implement the Basuna recommendations, and he didn't. So, as long as the Crown Prince is promising to do stuff, doesn't mean anything. Let's see some action here. Let's see the end of torture. Let's see people who should not be in prison be released. You know, the Crown Prince, I think, has it all to prove. He I think, 10 years ago, as we say in South London, he bottled it. He lost his nerve. I think he's been shown to be politically spineless. He has endorsed the repression. Now, if he suddenly wants to change and lead the country in a new direction, great, but he's got to do more than just say that. My fear is that he is trying to sell Bahrain as a place of economic liberalization without there being political liberalization. I'm not even sure that it's possible to do that, but I think that's what he's aiming at. Now, you know, I hear, of course, from Washington and from elsewhere that, you know, things are better because Biden is in the White House and the Crown Prince is now the Prime Minister. That's very different from a year ago when you had Trump and the old Prime Minister. Maybe, I mean, in itself, that doesn't change anything. If that's an improvement, then we need to see that it's an improvement. You know, the words of the EU resolution, the words of the Crown Prince, you know, Bahrain has been drowning in these well-meaning words for 10 years, while the situation has become steadily worse. So perhaps a little less talking, a little more action would be very helpful. But, you know, let's give it 3 months, 6 months. He's been Prime Minister for months now. You don't see an end to torture. You don't see anybody having been completely freed. Nabil, as we know, has been released with many conditions and can't travel. So if he means it, let's see it. You know, you must all be very fed up with these empty promises.
Yeah, and also there are also another thing that he mentioned, and then we move to another question. So also he mentioned that it's going soon to be widened with the alternative punishment system, focusing on implementing Childhood Protection Convention, based on which amendment will be made to the Reformation and Rehabilitation Organization law and its excuses regulation. And then so what do you think of these two? There is a new law or a new convention of law. It was signed on 14th of February, and it will be active enforced in law or active in law and 14th of August. And so what do you think of these things?
Much the same as I think of these other things, which are essentially promises. I mean, you know, Bahrain insists that there is, for instance, in law, freedom of expression, right? You can pass a law, you can tell the world that it's true, doesn't make it true. So passing the laws are an essential step, but actually having these things implemented are the more difficult step. And we've seen year after year after year, they set up these fake institutions and nothing much changes. In fact, it gets worse. They pass new laws, or they promise to pass new laws. Nothing really changes. You know, all of those, whatever there were, 36 recommendations in the Bassina report. The human rights situation is worse now than it was in November 2011. It's not rocket science for the Bahraini government to know what it needs to do. The EU resolution is just the latest iteration list of what it needs to do. But it's been told by human rights experts, by international governments, for at least the 10 years that I've been following this, and I'm sure for many years before that, what to do. It's not like it needs to invent a new path for itself. It just needs to respect international human rights standards. Passing new laws, all right, but you know, why don't you just stick to and implement the existing laws, respect them properly, don't have unfair trials, stop torturing people. The problem isn't that there aren't enough laws. The problem is simply that the laws that already exist aren't being respected.
Okay. Yeah. So you think that the problem is mainly with implementation of the law, or
it's political will. You know, you can criticize for instance the legal system because of unfair trials. You can criticize the institution of the police, security forces for torture, and all of that is right, it's true. But those things can be transformed, and really they can be transformed overnight if the king and or the crown prince were to say, let's stop doing it that way, and mean it. So it's not you know, Bahrain doesn't have to pass a whole new set of laws. It just has to stop torturing people. It's not that complicated. Like, an order from the palace tonight, no more torture by our security forces, would end it. And we've been waiting, as you know, Bahrain has been waiting decades and decades and decades for that to happen.
Yes. And also, before we move to, I mean, I think Tara will join us soon, and also another case. I mean, a recent case. I would like also to hear your opinion that 5 children were sentenced to 6 months in prisons, and then they were released with the rehabilitation program, and they were not sentenced, so they were released. So, and that was also on the same day of the EU resolution. So, do you think that has a connection, or how do you read this? Because a lot of people say that this is a result or a consequence of the EU resolution. Do you think? What do you think?
So I don't know. Is the truth. I think possibly, and what I think it does show is that proves, if there were any doubt, that the judiciary is not independent. I mean, the judiciary and the criminal justice system does what senior political figures tell it to do. Now, normally, you would say that's a bad thing for a country, and it is a bad thing for a country. On the other hand, it means that the senior political authority in Bahrain can, like I said, overnight change the criminal justice system. There can be an order written tonight to release human rights defenders from prison, to release prisoners of conscience without going through a whole judicial process. I mean, there aren't many benefits to a country living under dictatorship. In fact, there aren't any really. But this is one of the things when a ruling family has such ultimate power, it doesn't need to bother with the legal niceties. It can just let people out from prison. It can stop torture overnight. It can say we are not going to execute people from tomorrow. So Crown Prince can have all the meetings he wants with editors. He can promise this, that, and the other. But really, if he wants to show that they mean it, within days, they could issue these orders and transform the political environment overnight.
Yes, thank you. I mean, also the EU, a lot of EU Parliament, they mention also the Crown Prince himself, that many of them, they called him for a reconciliation and also for a dialogue, and many of them, so they name him and kind of relying on him to make a positive or positive steps forward. And just 1 second, and now we will open the comments so we can receive some question from the comments, and also I will try to add Tara, and then I will have also for you a final a question, but let's add just 1 second. I think Tara is facing some trouble. Okay, so this is not a question, this is just a comment. We need organization to put pressure on the government for human rights.
So my fear is that the Crown Prince is going to talk for a long time about all the good things that he's going to do. He's going to set up some governments which are currently critical, will think that they need to encourage this, and so we'll say some of the things like the EU resolution says, that, you know, this looks like real reform, good for you, and he's just going to be able to string that out for years and years, because I think the Bahraini government have been very good at doing that. So that's my fear. I mean, my hope, of course, is that he realizes that long term, he and the ruling family won't get away with that. But my worry is that, you know, the Biden administration, the EU, will sort of be bought off or willingly fooled by fake talk of reform, as they were in 2011 and 2012. So, you know, all the rhetoric, whether it's from the Crown Prince, the Prime Minister's office, or elsewhere in Bahrain, I mean, we've learned over the years it means absolutely nothing. You know, let's see some changes. Let's see some prisoner releases. Let's see an end to the reports of torture, the end of the stripping of citizenship. allow international NGOs back into Bahrain. I mean, you know, we're all familiar with the list of the stuff that they're doing wrong. And the cure for that is to stop doing those things, not to start promising all sorts of new legislation or new policies or any of that. Like, none of that matters. They know what to do. They're just refusing to do it.
Okay, so just also one, before I read this question, there is a question, but before this question, also you have mentioned right now the Biden administration, and also there were many discussions also in Bahrain social media platform. A lot of people also divided, like a lot of people optimistic of Biden's administration, especially after speaking out very clearly about Saudi Arabia in terms of human rights, Lujain, and they have specifically mentioned a lot of individual cases. And there are a lot of people think that also he might mention Bahrain in the next few weeks, months, I mean, or even his administration. And so what do you think also away from EU Parliament about Biden administration? Do you think they will push more for human rights, like very clear as Saudi Arabia?
I doubt it. I mean, I might be wrong. I hope I'm wrong. I think that the US Congress, or certainly some members of the US Congress, have really been pretty good consistently year after year. Now, whether or not that is going to be strong enough to really force the administration to change, I don't know. I mean, you know, the issue of Saudi, particularly around the war in Yemen, but also around particularly Lujain, although some of the other prisoners too, was a fairly big issue during the presidential campaign. And you know, when Biden came in, he had promised to reset the relationship between Washington and Saudi. And he took half a step, right? But, you know, the big step of sanctioning MBS, again, they backed out of that when the crunch came, right? So whether or not they're going to push further on that, I doubt it, unless there is much more pressure on them. And how much that translates onto Bahrain anyway, I doubt. I mean, I don't think that Trump will be better. But, you know, if we're going to go back to an Obama type approach to Bahrain, that was pretty disastrous too, right? So if people are hoping that Biden will say something in the next weeks or months, maybe he will. I have no inside information on that. But, you know, we heard Obama say in early May of 2011, calling on the Bahraini government to dialogue with the opposition, and telling it couldn't really do that while the opposition were in jail. But he only ever said that once publicly and didn't follow through with it. So my fear for the Biden administration, about the Biden administration, again, is they're going to be inconsistent in the rhetoric. Sometimes they're going to say critical things. Other times they're going to say things which really contradict that. But in the end, you know, the words aren't what matter. The words can enable other things to happen. But unless there's going to be serious sanctions against the Bahrain regime, including targeting individuals, unless they're really going to look at the weapons support they give, you know, the Bahraini government can be safe sleeping at night, knowing that the Biden administration may be critical of them publicly, but actually, if they carry on business as usual, then I don't think there's much encouragement for them to change.
Okay. Also, there is also another question similar also to Biden administration, but also from Dr. Jassim Hussain, saying that the government has overcome pressures from Obama administration and UPR. Can this time be different or more or the same? I mean, also, so it's also similar, but this is one of the questions, and there are also.
I think much the same. I mean, you know, like I said at the start, these resolutions, this pressure, the UPR, the being raised at the Human Rights Council, makes things awkward and uncomfortable for the Bahraini government. But we've seen, apart from really in mid-2011, very little movement from the Bahraini government. I mean, they feel that pressure and it makes them uncomfortable and they don't like it. But in terms of changing their practices, it doesn't alter very much. I think it's important to keep this pressure on because the alternative is to just give up. But while the pressure is only rhetorical, then I think that's not going to work. I think it needs much more. And quite how many governments are prepared to really hurt their own business interests and their own military interests, that's a much bigger thing to ask a government than to ask a government to publicly criticize the regime.
If there is no question, I mean, it would be your final words or message to the Bahraini government and after this resolution. So what will be your final comments, words, message to the Bahraini government after receiving the resolution?
In the highly unlikely event that the Bahraini government is listening to me, I would tell it that this pressure, these resolutions, we know how limited they are, but they're not going away. You know, if there is no change, these things will be back. And while they may not be enough to force you to change by themselves, we know you don't like them. We know that you're embarrassed by them. We know that every time there is one of these, it brings you further into that territory of being, you know, international outcasts, embarrassing company. And you should look at the example of other dictators. You know, once cracks began to appear, whether it was with Ben Ali in Tunisia, whether it was with Mubarak in Egypt, those people you thought were your friends in the EU, in Washington, they soon deserted you because they're not your friends. And so don't feel secure just because they're not sanctioning you. The day will come where there will be radical transformation. And, you know, the strange thing about that is we don't know when it will come. I bet however many Bahrainis are watching this now, I bet none of them could have known in the middle of January or the end of January 2011 what would be happening a month later. And nor did anyone in the ruling family. And so when somebody says, how long do we have to wait? Really, nobody knows. You know, it could be a long time and it could happen very suddenly. These things, as we saw 10 years ago, as we saw years before that with the Soviet Union, as we saw about the same time around 89, 90 in South Africa, these things just happen without warning, right? All the international experts, the super resourced spy agencies, these things happen so unpredictably, nobody knows that they're about to happen. So I'd say all of these things matter in terms of piling on the pressure, but when the authoritarian regime cracks, the worst thing about that is that there's no warning. But within weeks, it can all be over.
Perfect. Yeah, very clear answer. And suppose, I mean, Tara O'Grady is supposed to join us, but she has, I think, difficulties, technical difficulties. But anyway, I mean, it was a very interesting discussion, and it was my pleasure to have this discussion with you and to see your opinion on this, especially that this matters is, you know, it is very important for every Bahraini right now. Or a lot of people, families of prisoner of conscience, families of those sentenced to death penalty, families of victim of torture, and you know, thousands of people are following up this EU resolution and waiting and thinking what is going to be, is they are going to see their relatives and their members of family. So this is very important for everybody to know from an expert like you. Brian Dowley is a senior advisor at Human Rights First. Thank you for joining me today in my
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Bye bye now.
See you. Bye bye.